This reading is from the book of Numbers, chapter 20, and 1 Corinthians, chapter 10. Then the sons of Israel, the whole congregation, came to the wilderness of Zin in the first month, and the people stayed at Kadesh. Now Miriam died there and was buried there. There was no water for the congregation, and they assembled themselves against Moses and Aaron. The people thus contended with Moses and spoke, saying, "If only we had perished with our brothers when our brothers perished before the Lord. Why then have you brought the Lord's assembly into the wilderness for us and our beasts to die here? Why have you made us come up from Egypt to bring us to this wretched place? It is a place, not a place of grain or figs or vines or pomegranates, nor is there water to drink." Then Moses and Aaron came in from the presence of the assembly to the doorway of the tent of meeting and fell on their faces. Then the glory of the Lord appeared to them, and the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Take the rod, and you and your brother Aaron assemble the congregation and speak to the rock before their eyes, that it may yield its water. You shall thus bring forth water for them out of the rock, and let the congregation and their beasts drink." So Moses took the rod from before the Lord, just as he had commanded him. And Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly before the rock. And he said to them, "Listen now, you rebels, shall we bring forth water for you out of this rock?" Then Moses lifted up his hand and struck the rock twice with his rod, and water came forth abundantly, and the congregation and their beasts drank. But the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "Because you have not believed me to treat me as holy in the sight of the sons of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land which I have given them." Those were the waters of Meribah, because the sons of Israel contended with the Lord, and he proved himself holy among them. In 1 Corinthians 10. "For I do not want you to be unaware, brethren, that our fathers were all under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink, for they were drinking from a spiritual rock which followed them, and the rock was Christ." The word of the Lord. We're working through the book of Numbers, which, if you just want a way to remember it, it's kind of like Exodus part 2, it's the fourth book of the Bible. It tells the story of the wilderness wanderings. It tells the story when Israel was rescued from slavery in Egypt and brought out by the wonders of God, the plagues, the Passover, the passing through the Red Sea, brought out and led by the pillar of fire to Mount Sinai, where they met the God of Abraham for a year. And then God, in the pillar of fire, ascends and moves. And they follow this symbol of God's presence, and they begin journeying toward the promised land. And the book of Numbers tells the story of their journey. And at the core of the book, you'll find a series of 7 rebellions against Moses and against the leadership that God established, but really against God. And Moses, in this particular episode, aligns himself with the rebels. And in other words, Moses joins the rebellion against God. And the person, Moses, who was described just a few chapters ago as the humblest person then living on the face of the earth, when we meet him today in this episode, Moses is an angry, frustrated, defiant leader and defiant against God. This may be the 40th year, so we've kind of leapt forward in time, fast forward, and they've been wandering now perhaps for 40 years in the wilderness, and it is at this point that the leaders of the first generation will fade out of the scene. So the chapter opens up with the death of Miriam, and the chapter closes with the death of Aaron, and in the middle, Moses and Aaron sort of lose it. And both of those leaders will be thereby disqualified from entering the land of promise, as we just read. And they disobey a command from God, which seems to be sort of minor in the whole scope of things. I mean, Israel's been doing a lot of mischief, and there's been a lot of defiance against God. And one of the things that makes this passage a little obscure is on the first reading, we scratch our heads and wonder, wow, why the severity against Moses just for rapping the rock twice instead of speaking to it? What did Moses do that was so wrong that would disqualify him from entering the promised land? But this is not only the answer to that question, it is for us a cautionary tale that will appear again and again in the Bible. Moses' reason for disqualification, for instance, it'll come up in the 106th Psalm. It is an obscure section in some reasons because we don't know why the severe treatment of Moses here, at least on the first reading, but it is also putting the finger on one really important truth. It highlights a disorder that affects every person who really knows God. On the surface, it looks like it's about rage or frustration or kind of outburst of anger. And I think living in South Florida, we can all relate to those feelings of frustration and outbursts of anger. But under the surface, it is another facet, it is another perspective, another angle on the central flaw in the book of Numbers. And sadly, as we've seen, the central flaw in all of our lives, in all of our relationship with the Lord. Today we find another exposé of unbelief. Here, unbelief masquerades or expresses itself as anger, and what we have here in Moses' failure is a picture of an unbelieving believer. And that's what I want to look at today, a picture of an unbelieving believer. First, in three views. First, a telephoto view of the failings. Secondly, a wide-angle view of the antidote. And lastly, an interior view, an EKG of you and me. So first, close up on why they failed, then pulling back on the antidote that emerges in the whole context of the story, and lastly, getting in your face a little bit, in your heart a little bit. I want to have a kind of spiritual analysis of you and me and see how the passage relates. Remember, and if you're here for the first time in this series, I'll kind of explain it again, but the 7 revolts or rebellions that take place at the center of the book of Numbers are arranged very intentionally and deliberately in a kind of literary device called a chiasm. And in a chiasm, several elements or phrases or events are assembled in such a way, a list, that the first relates or corresponds to the last. And so in this particular book, the 7 revolts unfold in such a way that the first revolt is corresponding to the last revolt. And then the second revolt corresponds to the second to the last. And then the third corresponds to the third to the last. And all of our attention is drawn to the central rebellion, the fourth rebellion, which is their refusal to enter the promised land, and in which revolt you most clearly see the main source of their problem, which is unbelief. And it is that deliberate display of failure to trust in God that will keep them wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. It is that rebellion that shows us the root of all the rebellions, and that is unbelief. This is a people, we are a people, that have a really hard time simply trusting God. And we would much rather do things, make things happen, control things, than to be receivers, than to be dependent and reliant on God and His promises and His intentions and His love. In each of the revolts, we get a different angle, a new perspective on this problem, this failing, which affects us all, the failing of unbelief. And now today, in the sixth revolt, it begins with the people asking for water, just like they, in the corresponding revolt, cried out for meat. You may remember that from several weeks ago. And yet the way they put it, this desire for water, the way they voice it, makes it clear if we kind of zoom in. They interpret the lack of water as a sign that God does not care about them, that God is not good, and that God cannot be trusted. Quote, "Thus the people contended with Moses, saying, 'If only we had perished when our brothers perished before the Lord. Why then have you brought the Lord's assembly into the wilderness for us and our beasts to die here? Why have you made us come up out of Egypt to bring us into this wretched place? It is not a place of grain or figs or vines or pomegranates. In fact, there's not even water to drink.'" Once again, if you kind of zoom in, you'll see it. It's not just the people saying, "Hey, we're thirsty. What does a guy have to do to get a drink around here?" Something deeper is going on here in the way they word it. It's a questioning of God, of God's reliability, of God's character, of God's leaders, of the way God's arranged his relationship with them. It is a doubting of their destiny as a people, of their mission. It's a Thanksgiving story. This is Thanksgiving weekend, so this is fitting. We're looking at this passage. This is a passage about a people dreadfully lacking in gratitude. It's a people who almost willfully forget, and we've seen this in them before. They want to go back to Egypt, and we want to raise our hand and say, "Wait a minute, were you slaves in Egypt?" But it's about a people who willfully forget the blessings of God in their lives and willfully forget that God saved them from slavery by wonders. Wonders that people in that very generation saw with their own eyes, and they almost deliberately forget it. And they forget and are blind to the part that their own failings have played in the whole story. Did you hear the words? There's no figs, grapes, or pomegranates. If you've been with us for this whole series, you heard that combination of three fruits before. It's like, pulling the lever on a slot machine, and those three fruits come up. Figs, grapes, and pomegranates. And they have the audacity to say, here in the wilderness, there's no grapes, figs, or pomegranates. And you can only imagine Moses and Caleb and Joshua saying, yeah, there's no figs and grapes and pomegranates on this side of the promised land because it's over there. Remember that place where you didn't want to go? Remember we went into the promised land and we brought back the strange fruit of the promised land, which was figs, grapes, and pomegranates. And they were so big, the clusters of grapes were so massive, we had to carry it on giant poles. It's your failing that kept you away from this fruit. They really don't know God, and they really don't know themselves. And that's always how it goes. I was looking at, again, this week, John Calvin and his magnum opus called The Institutes of the Christian Religion, which he wrote, by the way, his great work when he was 27 years old. I thought to myself, man, I better get going. At 27 years old, he opens up this huge, several thousand page, volume with two observations. Number one, if you really want to know yourself, you have to know God. And if you really want to know God, you have to know yourself. And these people know neither themselves nor God. And their blatant disregard for their own failings makes it clear they have a spiritual and psychological sickness. I know in our own culture, we don't want to face our flaws because we think it's psychologically sick, but it's just the opposite. Unless we face our flaws, we are psychologically sick. And then the people's failings are met with the failings of the leaders. And Moses just sort of short circuits. And he ends up sounding so much like a parent here, by the way. Listen to me, you rebels. Do you want us to bring water out of a rock? Sounds like parents, they say, Mommy, I want this, Mommy, I want that. And they say, look, do you think money grows on trees? And Moses is saying, look, do you think water comes out of a rock? And what he's really saying is, you people require way too much from your leaders. We can't bring water out of nothing. And yet God did specifically say, Moses, trust me in this. Trust me to bring water out of the rock. Just speak to the rock so that the people can hear you. And let me be highlighted in my power to provide for my people. Trust me. Speak to the rock. But Moses is frustrated, because these rebellions have been going on for a long time. And this is now the 6th rebellion. And, as parents say, enough is enough. So angry and frustrated and rashly, he strikes the rock twice. And unwittingly, he plays right into the hands of the people, and he makes it all about his power and his vitality to produce water out of nothing. But despite the disobedience and despite the unbelief, God is still good, and God still, out of Moses' disobedience, still brings water for the people with some sort of underground river or well, and it opens up and gushing water so that the people and their livestock can eat. And then God zooms in even more in this telephoto view, and he diagnoses the real problem with Moses and Aaron as something more than just frustration or kind of rage disorder. He calls it what it is, verse 12, because you have not believed me to treat me as holy in the sight of the Israelites. And that's the telephoto view. That's the diagnosis. That's the close-up analysis of this failing. It's not simply exasperation. It's not simply that Moses is annoyed or frustrated. Anger is telling a deeper story in Moses. I think, and probably you heard me talk about this before if you've been at St. Andrews for a while, I think anger always tells a deeper story. And I got that idea from a book that helped me so much. I've quoted it many times here at St. Andrews, a book by Dan Allender and Tremper Longman. It's an analysis of the dark emotions in the book of Psalms. The name of the book is Cry of the Soul. And the book focuses on the dark emotions: anger, fear, contempt, jealousy, hatred. And it points out the truth that when these dark emotions come to the surface in our lives, they are more than not messengers from our motives. Something deeper than the behavior comes to the surface. And anger tells a deeper story about what is really motivating us to do what we do. Anger is a messenger from the front line of our hearts. Anger is a cry of the soul. And under the anger, Moses and Aaron are not believing God. That's what's really going on in their souls. They are, even Moses the Great and Aaron the High Priest, are unbelieving believers at this point. And when we take a step back, when we pull way out and see the whole scene in the whole context of the Bible story, when we take a wide-angle view, you'll begin to see the antidote emerge right out of the story, what's really going on here. Remember, at the very beginning of the wilderness journey, when they came out of Egypt in the book of Exodus, shortly after beginning the journey, they find themselves in a place without water, and the people cry out to Moses and to God, and they accuse God and they accuse Moses of bringing them into the desert in order to kill them. And then in Exodus chapter 17, there's this odd and terrible and beautiful scene that unfolds. God tells Moses, Moses, call together all the elders of the people. In other words, assemble the supreme court of the Israelites, and I will stand before you. And I pointed out, Moses must have thought to himself, Lord, with all due respect, I think what you meant to say is we will stand before you. Because, Lord, I don't know how it works there, wherever you are, but the way it works here is that the accused always stands before the judge. But Lord, you, I'm sure it didn't really mean it, you said you would stand before us. And that just totally reverses it, Lord. I know you didn't really mean that, but God meant exactly what he said. And God reiterates to Moses, I will stand before you. And in this scene, the judge will be judged. And you, Moses, will take the rod of justice, and you will strike the rock where I am standing. And I will show you that I am willing to take the blame for my people and their sin. And I, the judge, will be judged in your place. You will receive justice. I will receive justice, and you will receive mercy. And reluctantly, Moses did strike the rock, and water came gushing out of the rock, out of God's grace, out of God taking our blame, came water and vitality and refreshment and cleansing and life. And this is why the Apostle Paul, looking back on this period of Israel's history, this great cautionary tale in the book of Numbers and the wilderness wanderings, Paul writes to the Corinthians, see, even there, when the people were disobedient, Christ was the source of life. Christ was symbolically giving himself to be judged for his people. And the rock that was struck in Exodus chapter 17, the rock was Christ. And this makes the obscure clear. This was why Moses' outburst was so serious, because this act of unbelief communicated something false about God and his salvation, that God's salvation is something incomplete to which we have to add something. It failed to see that God intended to be judged once for all, the people of God, and that God would appear in human history once for all and perform something to which we could and must add nothing. It is finished. God would come at a point in human history, not only symbolically like he came in Exodus chapter 17, but God would actually incarnate. God would actually become a personage from history, a historical figure. God in Jesus Christ, God incarnate, would come and be presented on the stage of human history, and God in Jesus Christ would be hoisted up on a Roman cross, and God in Jesus Christ would be struck down, would be judged. The rock was Christ, judged for us, judged once for all. It is finished. And that event, the coming of God in the days of Pontius Pilate, would be retroactively applied to the people in the wilderness. You know, sometimes people are asked, how were people saved in the Old Testament? They were saved by performing sacrifices, right? And your answer should always be, no, they were saved by the same sacrifice that saves us. For us, it is applied forward. For them, it was applied backward, retroactively. It was the reason, Jesus Christ's death on the cross and resurrection, the reason why they could know God and why they could be forgiven once for all. And when Moses ignored that, it said something false about God. It ignored the specialness, the holiness of God, and the completeness of God's salvation. But the antidote, if you step back and look at it, the good news for Moses and Aaron, The good news for the rebels in the wilderness and the rebels at St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church. The good news for them and the good news for us is that Jesus Christ died once and for all believers, and his work is the source of life and refreshment, even for believers like us who are often unbelieving. Moses can't take us into the promised land, and obeying Moses' law cannot bring you to heaven. But the good news is we have a greater Moses who not only gave us the law, but who also kept the law for us, who lived the life we fail to live. And he, Jesus Christ, the greater Moses, he succeeds where Moses failed. The rock is Christ. He was the source of their life in the wilderness, and he is the source of our life. Now for the EKG. If I could, I'd like to just sort of guide you into a kind of electrocardiogram into your own heart, and a way that you can understand what's going on at the deeper level, deeper than your behavior, and how the gospel might speak to what's going on in the EKG. Today I want to give you a kind of diagnostic tool for your heart, and I want to show that we, like Moses, are often unbelieving believers. Now, when I say unbelieving believers, I'm not talking about true believers, and I feel pretty confident that we have some true unbelievers here. And you may be visiting us today. You may think of Jesus Christ as someone that you admire. You may think of Jesus Christ as an example to be followed, but you have never, as the old writers used to say, you have never closed with Christ. You know that terminology? A closing? If you live in Florida, you know something about closings, because everyone in Florida knows something about real estate. And a closing in real estate is, of course, when you sit down at the table and you sign on the dotted line. And I'm talking about people who may admire Jesus Christ, but who have not closed with Jesus Christ. You have not signed on the dotted line. You have not received his grace and given him your guilt. You have not put your past, present, and future into the nail-scarred hands of Jesus Christ. And if that describes you, well, the best thing you can do, your next move, in fact, is to come out with your hands up and close with Christ. Receive him. Give him your guilt and trust him to save and to rule in your life, to be your Savior and your Lord. But what I'm really concerned with today, and what I am more certain about, is that many of us, many of you, many more people here, in fact, all the rest of the people here, have closed with Christ, and you are more than admirers, you are believers. And yet, if you could be honest with yourself, if you could read your own heart, if you could see a spiritual electrocardiogram and see the motives of your life, you would be forced to admit. Truth is, TJ, if you saw me in my daily routine, I am quite often an unbelieving believer. It may be anger. It may be some extreme frustration where you find yourself just short-circuiting at the kids or short-circuiting at work. It may be just a kind of constant low-level annoyance, any shade of anger. And there are many shades of anger. I've said so many times, Eskimos have like 24 words for snow. You know how many words we have for anger? Doesn't it say something about our culture? Right before the first service this morning, I just looked it up on a thesaurus website. Anger, animosity, annoyance, displeasure, exasperation, fury, impatience, ire, mad, indignation, irritation, outrage, resentment, rage, temper, bothered, frustrated, ticked off, in a huff, stewing, bitter. And that's just part of it. Man, anger is a huge part of our lives. And what does anger say about our lives? And that's what I'm asking us to do, to look at anger as a kind of EKG that is telling us what's going on at the deeper levels under the behavior, what's going on in our motives, in our souls. Maybe anger that exposes your unbelief. You may be frustrated, thinking that it all depends on you and that things have to go your way. And you may be in that posture, interpreting circumstances, and you may be thinking to yourself, this family crisis, which is so oppressive, or this present moment of unemployment when I was treated so unfairly, or this awful situation at work, this death in my family where a loved one was taken from me, this breakup of an engagement or a marriage, this period of abject loneliness in my life. I have no choice but to interpret this as a sign that God has abandoned me, or that God isn't real, or that God doesn't work, or that God is not going to keep his promise, or that God cannot be trusted, and that God is not good. And that's why I find myself angry and frustrated and annoyed. And I guess what I've learned is, if I don't make it happen, it ain't going to happen. And this occurs very frequently in our lives. All the time. Believers in Jesus Christ find themselves unbelieving believers. It's quite common in the Bible. Did you know that the prophets have a phrase that comes up again and again? The arm of the flesh. The idea is, I believe God and I trust his covenant promises, but I'm trusting myself to get it done. The New Testament writer James will say something very similar. He will write, the anger of man does not achieve the righteousness of God. In other words, what he's saying is, making it happen. Not trusting and resting in God's promises and the finished work of Jesus Christ, but forcing it, working it, striking the rock. Once, twice, 3 times, or as many times as I have to make it happen. James says that will not bring about the purposes of God or produce the fruit of the Spirit in your life. Or it could be other dark emotions, not just anger, but things like shame or fear or contempt that rise to the surface in your life. And if you'll take the time to analyze it, rather than just trying to manage it or suppress it, it might tell you what's really going on in your soul. It might be shame or fear as you find yourself always trying to prove yourself to this person or those people, your parents or your children or your coworkers. Always trying to show that you're good, that you're worthy, that you're deserving, that you're lovable. And it's really driven by fear or shame. And why? Why do we find ourselves so often in those situations? Maybe the next time it happens, you could let the gospel read and address your spiritual EKG. And when the dark emotions come up the next time, maybe the gospel could speak to those dark emotions. Maybe the gospel could speak to your angry, frustrated, shameful, fearful, contemptuous heart. And maybe the gospel could say, is it not enough that the Son of God loved you and gave himself for you? Is it not sufficient that Christ is the rock, and the rock was struck once for all, and it is finished? He was judged for all who trust him, so that the critique that belongs to him is now applied to you. This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased, is spoken over you. Man, you can't add to that, and you don't have to. Is it not enough? Are you looking to Christ plus? Oh, don't get me wrong, I'm a believer. I need Jesus Christ, and I trust him that I am utterly forgiven, and that the Father is delighted in me, But I also need to put up those big numbers on the sales board at work if I really want to feel good about myself. Or I have to have kids that are perfectly behaved. Or I have to be known as a person who lives a serious and disciplined life. Or I have to be a party girl. I have to be the life of the party. Christ plus. It's the reason C.S. Lewis titled his famous book, by the way, Mere Christianity. What he meant was, let's get rid of the plus and just have Christ himself. Really, ask yourself in this coming week, as you get feedback from the EKG, as dark emotions come to the surface in your life. And look, as long as we have I-95, the dark emotions will be rising to the surface of my life. But really ask yourself, it's the main question I want to put across in this sermon. What about the good news of Jesus Christ am I in this moment not believing? Where do I see some deficiency in what Jesus Christ has done for me? Where am I saying out one side of my mouth, in Christ alone, and at the other side of my mouth, and the approval of people, and comfort, and a car that doesn't break down, and a super happy marriage? Christ plus my sacrifices, or Christ plus anything else? I said to unbelievers that your answer is to come out with your hands up. But let me now say to unbelieving believers, the answer for you is to come out with your hands up. Repent and rest. Listen to the words of the old hymn. View him weeping in the garden. On the ground your Maker lies. On the bloody tree behold him. Sinner, will this not suffice? Let's pray together.